It's a great pleasure to speak to you. I've spoken to many Western Front Association groups in my time, especially here in Canada, where we have a great association in Ottawa near Toronto, where Glenn Kerr is the longtime president, and out in Victoria as well, and many other Canadians who are deeply interested and I think touched by the Great War experience, and who continue to find great meaning in exploring our shared history. Normally, I'm a kind of animated speaker. You'll see my hands pop up every once in a while. I think I would normally be roaming a room. I've been known to have a spit fly from my mouth. It's a good thing, I guess, that we are socially distanced here and in very different places. But one of the things I really do love about meeting people is hearing their stories. What is it that got you interested in the Great War? How does it resonate in your life? Is it a part of your family history? Is it something that you approach in an academic sense? Is there a material object, an artifact that you have had passed down from generation to generation that links you to the past? These are stories I would normally, encourage people to share. So I suppose if there is a Q&A session, as I know there is, and a commentary, feel free to add some thoughts there. And I think David's going to read some of them out to me. I'm going to try to speak to about 40 minutes about my book. You can see it here, The Secret History of Soldiers. It was my 11th book. I've since published 2 more books, and just trying to see, there they are. They both came out in 2020. The edited collection there with Jack Granestein, who is our greatest historian in this country. We edited that. It's on the year 1919. I think some of you will be very interested in that year of turmoil, the year of the return of the veterans. It was a conference we held at the Canadian War Museum in support of an exhibition that Jack and I did on the 100 Days campaign. And that was a major exhibition that ran in late 2018 into 2019. And really a desire from the museum to share the important stories of 1918 in this country, I think, like in Britain and perhaps around the world. There's a great emphasis on 1915. In the case of Canada, I'll speak just to the Second Battle of Ypres, in the Battle of the Somme and the Canadian contributions there, and of course, Vimy Ridge, a really key event in Canadian history. But by the 100 Days campaign, most Canadians don't seem to know those stories and the important role of the Allies in the ultimate defeat of Germany on the Western Front. So that was an exhibition we did and a book there. And my newest book that just came out last week, which is about the Second World War and the memory of the Second World War in Canada. And the way that the Great War dominates the cultural and commemorative realm in Canada. And really the poor way that Canadians have told those stories. So you may be interested in getting a hold of those as well. But tonight's talk is going to be on The Secret History of Soldiers. And this is a book that for me, like I think so many authors, really goes back many, many years. And in my case, goes back to 1995, when I was a young guy. I was at the Royal Military College of Canada. I was there on a civilian scholarship in the Masters of War Studies program. And I was investigating gas warfare in the First World War. And that later became my first book, No Place to Run. But as I was researching gas and I was reading the letters and the diaries and the memoirs of the soldiers, I kept, looking for that 3-letter word gas. I kept coming across another 3-letter word, and it was rum. And it took me a while to figure out the importance of rum, but eventually I realized that rum, as many of you know, was an important combat motivator for soldiers. It was given usually in the morning and at night at stand to and stand down. It was a part of a reward system. There was an interplay of power between officers and NCOs and the enlisted men. Soldiers could be enticed to go out and do important work, a patrol, a raid, bring in a wounded comrade. They'd get a double shot of rum. Rum was important to understanding the social history of the soldiers. But I also found that rum was incorporated into the songs of the soldiers and into the poetry and into their cartoons. And it took me a while to figure this out, that there was this underlying culture here to these soldiers that I was getting to know as a young man I would have been about 23 or 24 at the time, and just beginning my journey and my study of the Great War. As I said, No Place to Run became my first book, and every book has a history like this, and that cultural side of the songs and the poetry and the trench newspaper stuck with me. And just to tell you a little bit about myself, as you heard from David, I was for almost 20 years the Great War historian at the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, and we built a new museum in 2005, and I was very lucky to be responsible for that First World War gallery. And as I researched and studied the material culture and looked at the photographs of the time period and the works of art, I began to read and develop still greater knowledge of who these Canadians were. I published a 2-volume history on that, of which you can see the first volume there at the sharp end in 2007. And these were national bestsellers. It was quite remarkable because military history in Canada does not sell as well or is not read as often as it is in Britain or even the United States. And all of this was a part of my understanding again and trying to come to grips with this generation of Canadians. And I published many other books since then without going into all the details, but The Secret History came out in 2018, and I was really pleased with the reception. It was a national bestseller. It won national writing awards and national history awards. And it reaffirmed to me the power of the Great War in Canadian history and Canadian culture. This was a book that is based upon many news sources that I have dug out of the archives. And yet, for the most part, it is about and drawn from the letters of those soldiers. And I know you have probably read many of those letters in published form or in the archives. You may have some in your own family. That have been passed down through generations. But for me, those letters have always been so powerful, those eyewitness accounts. And I'm very lucky to have read thousands and perhaps tens of thousands of these letters over time. They are mundane, they're banal, but also filled with horror and tragedy. There is great heroics there, and also soldiers talking honestly about their fears, their struggle, their strain. That's the human element of war that is so important to me, and I find so important with my readers as well. And over the years, I've written about weapons and the evolution of tactics and doctrine and commanders and the home front experience in multiple wars, but I've always come back to that human experience. And one of those key questions for me in both my books on the First World War and the Second World War are, how did these young men, and I guess later on young men, women as well, how did they cope? How did they endure? How did they survive? And secondly, I guess, how did they make sense of that war experience? How did they come, the survivors and their loved ones, how did they come to understand this war? And I think that's really the core of The Secret History of Soldiers. As I read these thousands of letters and looked at other sources, I began to see a unique soldier's culture. And I think that culture is important to understanding the ability of the soldiers to endure and to push forward. I love these two photographs here because I think they remind us of other experiences of war. We see a theater group on my left. I don't know if that's your left or right. And that older soldier there eating blueberries from his helmet. I love this image, and I use this at the Canadian War Museum to remind us that it's not all just 18-year-old kids, that there were 30-year-olds and 40-year-olds, and of course, thousands of overage soldiers who lied about their age, and that this reminds us, I think, of the many experiences that make up the Great War, as we call it, and in Canada's case, the particular Canadian Corps experience. And as I researched and wrote about this experience, I began to see a culture emerge, as I said. And a culture is a really loaded word, and I've read many books on culture. I define it in a very broad sense, a bit like as an anthropological definition. Culture includes beliefs, practices, customs, values that define groups of peoples, societies, and nations. Culture is also created in communities and is shared to strengthen bonds and relationships. And it consists, and this is important, both highbrow artistic endeavors and the everyday experience of individuals to provide social meaning and insight into a group. Now that sounds pretty academic, but I think what I'm really talking about here is the culture of a closed group, of a society, the society of soldiers. And if you know anything, as I think you do, it was a society that helped to sustain the soldiers, but it was also kept them separate from the civilians on the various home fronts. And the culture that I'm talking about is one that's very much rooted on the Western Front. There's a different culture in hospitals that has been written about. There's a different culture in training camps, but mine is really rooted in those places of destruction, those spaces of violence on the Western Front. Now, just to pivot away just for a second into the modern period of culture, I just want to talk about culture writ large. And if we think of the Great War, and I'm not the first one to make this observation, but it's important, especially in the Canadian context, I think almost all of our cultural products focus on the harrowing and horrifying experiences of war. It's about grim, stoic soldiers staring into no man's land. Death surrounds them. Almost all of the war's histories, through fiction and through plays, and now more recently through films, portray the soldiers as victims. Victims caught in the machine of industrialized warfare. Now, I don't think that that's wrong. I think that often the soldiers were victimized, but they were not simply victims. They were not zombie-like moving forward until a bullet put them out of their existence, or more likely a shell splinter. They were fighting back against this war experience. There is considerable soldiers' agency in everything they do, and it's really revealed in the culture of the soldiers. And I want you to keep that in mind, because I'll come back to that. Just as an aside, as you can see with the two posters here, I think you know of Mel Gibson's Gallipoli. It was one of the first war films I ever saw, had a tremendous impact on me. The other one is the only really Canadian war film that's been produced. There are a number of ones from several decades ago that aren't terribly good. This was our major film done in 2008 called Passchendaele, set around Passchendaele. I've written about it. It takes a lot to make a movie in Canada. We're a pretty small market, and it's not easy to make a movie. I think most people who know the Great War were disappointed in some way by this film. There's an agonizing love story that really burdens it. But the message is important, and Paul Gross, who wrote and directed it and acted in it, and one of our finest actors, really brought this to the big screen. He had a grandfather who served in the Great War, and he has talked about the impact of that war on his life and on his family. And I thank him for that. If you ever have a chance to see it, you might like to explore it. But again, to come back to these cultural films, in almost every single one, the soldiers seem helpless, they're lost, they are destroyed physically and mentally. Indeed, the trope of shell shock is a powerful one in almost all of the modern cultural products. It's not wrong, and I think we have a greater sense now of the impact of war on individuals, the invisible wounds, the scars to the mind that are imprinted by war. And yet historians like Mark Humphreys in Canada have determined that about 15,000 Canadians suffered from shell shock, and of course, we know it went through various diagnoses, both as a physical wound and a accumulation of stress and strain and everything in between. But what's always struck me is that of the 450,000 Canadians who went overseas, why didn't they all break down? Why didn't they all suffer mental wounds? And maybe some would argue that many did. They were just able to carry and bear that burden. And yet, for the most part, I think even if we were to indulge in that everyone carried a mental wound, almost all of them were able to continue functioning as soldiers, continuing to do their job. And there are many reasons for that. But one of them, I would argue, is the culture of the soldiers, the way that they banded together, the way that they relied upon each other. Some scholars and members of armed forces talk about this as combat cohesion, small groups coming together. And I would argue, reading the letters and the diaries and the memoirs and the trench newspapers and other sources, that also there is a culture that binds the soldiers together. And so insofar as combat motivation is created and sustained by good officers and junior leaders, and rewards like rum and leave and medals and punishment, like all of the various field punishments, all the way up into the firing squad and other factors, I argue in my book that culture is another way in which to understand combat motivation and why the soldiers kept fighting. And I think that's really important. This is culture as a shield. And I think it has largely been overlooked by historians. Before I launch really into this, I think it's worthwhile to know who are the Canadians. I love this photograph of these three guys. I always think if I walked down the street and saw them without their uniforms on, with their steel helmets and their small box respirators on their chest, they look like us today. Yeah, the teeth are a lot worse than most Canadians with our healthcare system. And yet they could be us. And I think that's important to remember, that sense of agency, that they're not just historical actors. They were young men and sometimes middle-aged, struggling to survive. They cried, they feared for their wives and children and mothers and fathers at home, but they laughed and they played pranks on each other, and they did all the things that young men do. And that's a part of this culture as well. There were about 630,000 Canadians who enlisted in the war or were conscripted. About 110,000 were conscripted from late 1917. They were, for the most part, citizen soldiers. We had almost no professional army before the war. There was about 3,000 Canadian professional soldiers. They came from every region in Canada. Every province, every major city, every town, almost every village. They came from all classes. Almost every religion was represented. And we know actually quite a lot about the social history of these soldiers from the attestation papers. They were about an average height of 5'7", average age of 26, although younger in the front lines, about 23, and about an average of what we'd now say a grade 6 level of education in Canada. And I'm not sure what that translates in Britain and around the world. When I go to Australia and speak there, I'm always trying to figure this out. I think that they were an average group of men. And what I think is really interesting, as some of you may know, I've written about the Canadian soldier, the perception of the soldier. Canada was very lucky to have Lord Beaverbrook, that impish kingmaker, the multi-millionaire who'd fled Canada after having, most people suggest, embezzled a tremendous amount of money, friend to Churchill and Lloyd George. He really went out of his way to raise the profile of the Canadian forces, creating an art program and all the photography, the official photography you see, and historians, and really to help carve out a Canadian reputation. But when one looks at some of the hard statistics on education, on height, on class, the Canadian and the British soldier look very similar. And we shouldn't be too surprised. About half of the CEF, the Canadian Expeditionary Force, were British born. And there's often a fierce debate about, well, were they born in somewhere in Britain and then came to Canada when they were 5 years old, or did they come in 1913? And it's not an easy way to understand how long they were in Canada, although the attestation papers sometimes suggest that. But I think that there are great commonalities. And looking at the culture of these soldiers, which I'm going to launch into pretty soon, one sees a lot of commonalities if we just think of the British soldier or the Australian or the American. But there are also identifiably national characteristics. And one of the sub-themes of my book is to look at how this culture helped to distinguish the Canadian soldier as well as bringing the Canadian and the British soldiers or the Empire soldiers together. So that's something too, if you have an interest in that, you might wish to explore that, and I will come back to that. And so this culture of survival, as I call it, includes all kinds of things: vaudeville skits, cheeky stand-up comedy routines, songs, and widely circulating jokes mixed with irreverent soldier-published newspapers, more subversive elements like rumors and superstitions and slang and graffiti. And much of this, in fact, was a pushback against authority. And you really see the agency here. There's a strong anti-authoritarianism in these songs and plays and cartoons that the Canadian soldiers published and created and shared amongst themselves. And I'll just show you two cartoons here. These come from Canadian trench newspaper, The Listening Post, and I'll talk about them in a bit, but it gives you a little bit of a sense here. The cartoon on the left, these were drawn by soldiers for soldiers. And when I began working on this field in the early 21st century, very few people had used trench newspapers as a source. It's more common now because they're an incredible resource, I think, to understand the soldiers' experience, their society, their culture, what enraged them, what unified them, what allowed them to push forward. But these are two interesting cartoons in that kind of anti-heroic bent. The one on the left, you see the officer behind the desk, and you see a private standing before him, somewhat shaken. And if I'll have to read this for you, I think, but the officer says to the applicant for transfer to the MT, the motor transports, "What do you know about motors?" And the private says, "Only that they don't go in the trenches, sir." This is where you would laugh, and I would go, "Oh, yes, yes, yes." And then the cartoon on the right, another one in a similar vein, we have an officer speaking to a private, and the cartoonist here, Hugh Farmer, who was the most popular Canadian cartoonist of the war, very much in the vein of Bruce Bain's father. He writes a private cold feet, and in fact, this is covered a bit here, but he says something like, if you were in the trenches and the Germans were coming at you, what steps would you take? Sorry, it's covered by the screen. And Private Coldfeet, giving away a bit of the joke, promptly says, "Long, quick ones, sir. Long, quick ones." He's going to run away. Now, when I saw these for the first time, I thought, I mean, how do these get published in a trench newspaper? I mean, isn't this subversive at the very least? And isn't this advocating for soldiers running away from the front? Well, it's not. But I think it offers a bit of a view, a significant view into the experience of soldiers, what they found funny, how they were pushing back against authority, how they were pushing back against the idealized soldier as constructed on the various home fronts, our brave boys fighting overseas, and only one more push and the Hun shall be driven back. The soldiers were understood that was not likely the case after any time at the front, and they pushed back against the heroic. And I think this is just one example of what you see in the culture. And I talk in greater detail in the book. There are cartoons about shell shock. There is an open discussion about court-martials and punishment, and even the shooting of soldiers. And in the Great War, 25 Canadians were executed by firing squad. All kinds of topics are covered here, but I think that they're really fascinating, and they give us a sense into the hidden history of these soldiers. And many of these, in addition to the letters and diaries, come in the trench newspapers, as they have been called. And I find these an incredible resource. They were created by the citizen soldiers. When we talk about citizen soldiers, they were farmers and clerks and students and bankers, but they also include editors and cartoonists and poets. And I've been able to go through all of the surviving newspapers. There are about 30 for the Canadians, including the Listening Post, one of the most famous, which at the midpoint of the war, about in 17, about 20,000 copies were circulating with each issue. So really an incredible reach here. And they're a resource that captures the poetry, the prose, the jokes, and really a fascinating source that I used to develop my thesis, I suppose, on soldiers' culture. As part of this culture, there was a strong current of humor. And again, if we think of those cultural products of being so grim and dark, and it's always raining, and no one seems to remember that there is a summer season in France or Belgium as well. It's always rainy and Passchendaele-like, and no one is ever laughing. Well, that's just not true. If you've read soldiers' letters and diaries and memoirs and the newspapers, you know there's a great vein of humor, and I argue that it's often a dark humor, a gallows humor, and yet it's a humor that sustains them. And this is an image here of one of the Canadian theater groups, which were being put on behind the lines. But I go beyond the theater groups into all kinds of soldier performances that happen in barns behind the lines, in dugouts, great storytellers, card tricks. I came across once a guide on how to do puppet shows in the trenches. That shook my faith. It shook my faith that I understood who these soldiers were, having spent 25 years studying them. If they were being encouraged to put on puppet shows and hand string to amaze their colleagues, there's always something new to learn about the Great War experience, something that fascinates me every single day, as I imagine it does for many of you as well. Tom Leask, was a private with a Canadian Field Ambulance. He wrote this to a friend at home, and throughout the book, I have hundreds of letters and accounts from these eyewitnesses. He wrote this: "It is a very strenuous life and a hard game. The people in Canada have no idea, nor can any person have unless they have been in it. The spirit of the soldiers, however, is wonderful. They meet everything with a smile. I sometimes think that to them, death is a joke." Now, death was not a joke, but in a war where soldiers could scream or laugh, most chose the latter. This dark humor, this gallows humor, is a crucial part of the soldier society, and I would suggest a crucial aspect of how they coped and endured and survived. And I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to pivot now just into another aspect of culture. And of course, there was a material culture. I work at the Canadian War Museum. I'm deeply interested in the material culture of war. And one of the things I found in almost every single soldier's account was the souveniring. In fact, this was a word that they created. It meant to collect souvenirs, to collect material culture. And I love the postcard there on the left, the optimist, using one of those soldiers' phrases, something do. And you can see he's gathered up his war trophies. The challenge, of course, was getting them home. You weren't allowed to send them in the mail, so you had to smuggle them out. Often soldiers buried them. I encountered all kinds of soldiers talking about burying their treasures on the Western Front. And I have sometimes been haunted by that thought of all of these little stashes of treasure that are probably still there 103 or 5 years later. And the cartoon on the right, one of the famous Bainesfather ones, don't do that. Those of you who lead Western Front tours, as I have, as I'm sure you have or been involved, there are shells everywhere. Every time I'm over, someone is being blown up and they're doing this kind of thing. But it's a great cartoon, the nonchalant soldier kind of looking at his buddy who's trying to get off the shell fuse. And this collection of material, I argue, is really important, again, to understand the soldiering experience. And I talk about the value of souvenirs and sending them home to loved ones. They're symbols of that the soldiers at the front. There was a fierce trade and sale of trench art. And what I'll focus on, I guess, is not the souvenirs, but the trench art, which was created. And I could talk about art in many ways, but what I think is interesting about the trench art is that this is lowbrow art. At the Canadian War Museum, as I mentioned, we have Beaverbrook's War Art Collection, about 800 works. It's the second best, I think, in the world next to the Imperial War Museum. Stunning works of art, over 100 artists who painted in the Canadian War Memorials Fund, which was its official name. And yet trench art was not collected. It was not deemed worthy, I think. You see the difference between the highbrow and the lowbrow culture there. In fact, as we know, for the soldiers who wanted it, who made it, who traded it, they risked punishment. They weren't supposed to be using army material for this. And again, it offers a glimpse into the hidden history of the soldiers, that they were creating this material. And in the book, in the final section, I look at the memory and what happens to the soldiers' culture when it goes back to Canada. And of course, these memory objects, I think, then take on a different meaning. The 18-pounders that are fluted there with the engravings, the 303 candlestick. These are objects of art. And at the War Museum, I think we have about 200 pieces and a fairly good provenance. And so I write about the art, but again, as something coming up from the ranks, a history from below. Another aspect, I think, of my book, and especially of soldiers' culture, is the singing and the songs. There's a great material culture of voice and singing. You can see two of the song sheets here. There were about 500 wartime songs published in the war, and I think this stuff is fascinating. One of the unknown, forgotten Canadians is Lieutenant Gitz Rice. Some of you will know his song, Keep Your Head Down, Fritzy Boy, and Dear Old Pal of Mine. They were monster hits, if one can use that term. He was a singer from Montreal. He'd been shot in the throat at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915. He came back to his unit and he continued to sing behind the lines, carrying on a bit like Harry Lauder and others, sing songs for the Canadians. And on the right there, one of the many song sheets produced in Canada. Maurice Manley was a small little singing sensation, a young girl who sang these fiercely patriotic songs. I quite like the Hello Canada. It was not a hit in any way. I particularly like the soldiers coming off the troop ship wearing what kind of looks like saucepans on their heads and lipstick. But that gives you a sense of some of the song sheet music that was produced to be sung. I talk about this in the book, but I also talk about the soldiers singing. And then singing, of course, brings soldiers together. This idea of combat cohesion, of coming together. We don't think of singing and songs, but it's absolutely crucial, as is telling stories and sharing rumors. And soldiers sang everything: cheerful pop songs, wistful romantic refrains, swaggering masculine ditties of drink and girls, but also hymns and folk songs. And I think they love to parody songs. In the book, I've been able to recover many of the songs that were written in letters and diaries that soldiers wrote themselves, and they're fascinating. And I would normally sing this to you if we were in a small, intimate room, and I was sure you weren't going to laugh at me, but I think I'll pass. It would feel very odd to be singing in my empty living room here. But the songs speak to all kinds of subjects, but there are many that speak to resilience, to endurance, to sucking it up, to sticking it, to one of those great phrases of the soldiers. And I talk about them in the book. I think it's a clue to understanding how, again, they coped and endured in really unimaginable situations. And the songs have many meanings. I talk about French Canadians and bringing their songs in French into this English army, of which the Canadian Expeditionary Force was. I talk about new Canadians, Ukrainian Canadians, and Russian Canadians, who we think at least about 12,000 served in the CEF. 4,000 Indigenous Canadians who served. I have found references to their songs and symbolic acts. And we see all kinds of elements coming through here, including overtly national Canadian songs. "O Canada," which doesn't become the national anthem in Canada until late into the 20th century, was being sung in an informal way, as well as many other songs. And so, again, we see aspects of masculinity. There's aspects of class, identity, and I think very much on the nature of singing and how it brought soldiers together. As part of this singing, there was a great, vibrant oral culture, and I talk about slang and swearing in the book. It was a language unto itself, and I've written about this for some time, and there's recently been some interesting books that have come out on this. But to find the particular Canadian slang and sayings is really interesting. Again, to this idea of a unique Canadian culture that emerges, a unique wartime culture that we never knew about or that we had never written about in a particular way. And I argue that in Canada, many historians, myself included, talk about the transformative effects of this war on Canada, how Canada was forever changed. And there's many ways to look at this in the political realm, and Canada stepping out onto the world stage through finance and the economy, through social changes and the introduction of the vote for women, through the introduction of income tax. It goes on. Culture, yes, but it hasn't been very prominent in the writings. And I think if my book has a significant contribution in Canada, in a realm outside of military history, I think it may be that one, to remind non-specialists that this rich culture that is brought back to Canada after the war is really a cultural strain that becomes part of the mainstream. And I think that that's really important to understanding the Canada that emerges from the terrible victory that in late 1918. The book also talks about profanity and swearing, and some of that was my favorite parts to write about. I would give papers at academic conferences and dropping F-bombs all over the place, because soldiers, as we know, swore like sailors. And I talk about swearing and the importance of swearing to the soldiers and creating a hard edge in helping them cope and endure. But there's also an element here to the identity. And a pre-war clergyman, Tom Johnson, who served with the 102nd Battalion, he wrote his memoirs when he was 100 years old. Pretty amazing. And he wrote this, and it's a lovely quote. I want to read it to you. It's a bit long, but he wrote this. Let me contrast the difference between the Canadian and the Englishman with one example. The Canadian swears more. His language is richer and more original in curses and obscenity. Now, the Englishman swears too, but it's hackneyed and lacking in ideas. He swears with a sort of apology in his voice, whereas the Canadian is conscious that he is inventing phrases which are his own, so he has pride in his language. This originality tends to make him a more dangerous opponent. Feel free to laugh at that. I don't think swearing makes you a more dangerous opponent, but I do think it's interesting that he was not alone there, in talking about how Canadians swore and the slang they used, how it helped to distinguish them, and how it fed into what I call identity construction, but really the creation of the Canadian Corps' reputation in the Canadian soldiers. The vulgarity also forged bonds among the Canadian soldiers. While it was an English army, as I mentioned, there were tens of thousands of French Canadians, new Canadians, Indigenous Canadians, and it's very clear in the letters and the memoirs that one of the ways they bonded and were able to communicate is through pidgin English to some degree, but also swearing. That swearing was an important way to get around some of the language challenges. And if you've ever been in a hockey dressing room, maybe the equivalent is cricket, certainly football, you know that there's a very manly atmosphere there. And this is certainly the case in the trenches. And I talk about some of these hardening aspects which are important. They also, importantly, swearing, again, help to distance soldiers from civilians, which is really important for this culture and this understanding. Now, of course, the Great Divide, I think, in addition, was not swearing or singing, but was death. That's the Great Divide between the soldiers believing what they were fighting for and civilians at home. And death, of course, was everywhere. Bodies were jutting from the trenches. And I have a whole chapter, it was my favorite chapter, writing about death culture. Infantryman John Becker described the black and bloated dead, covered with flies and maggots, a sight that would turn the stomach of one who had not grown accustomed to such sights. And he talks later about joking with the dead, the arms and hands that jutted from trench walls, and lighting matches off the skulls of corpses, and playing with the bones. And I talk about this in the book, and the calloused effect this had on soldiers. But Becker offers a clue, and he finished by saying, Without such cruel jokes, I quote, we would have gone crazy. We would have gone crazy. And that's my point. Without the songs and the swearing and the material culture and the theater and all the other things, we would have gone crazy. And there is dark humor throughout. And I want to shut this down over maybe the next 5 minutes to allow time for questions and comments. But I write about magical thinking, and this is, again, fabulous research. And in Canada, nothing written on this. There is a small body of literature on seances after the war and parents who turn to spiritualism to really try to come to grips with their fallen sons and daughters and others. But I write about the important role of death and the supernatural and spiritualism and the uncanny among the soldiers. And I think that's important. The two images you see on your screen here, on the one on my right by Percy Smith, I think captures death personified. And the soldiers talk about death as an animal, as a being that is waiting for them, ready to pounce. And I saw it so often in the letters and diaries that it really struck me about this idea that death was waiting, and that death was incarnate. And the painting on the left is called The Conquerors by Eric Kennington, and this doesn't do justice to it. It's probably about 12 feet across and 12, maybe 18 feet high. It's a stunning work, and it's at the Canadian War Museum, and it depicts a Canadian battalion, a Scottish battalion. You can see the kilts there as they march forward over the bones of the enemy and perhaps of their comrades. What's fascinating about this work of art is that Kennington wrote that the pale-faced soldiers were the dead who march with their comrades. And I think it gives a sense, again, of this idea of the dead who inhabit the Western Front, the presence of the fallen. And it's one, of course, that continues to this day. Those of you who have been to the Western Front, and I hazard a guess almost all of you have, one feels the weight of history there. One feels in these spaces of tremendous violence, something that is quite different and even uncanny at times. And I write about that in the book, and the importance of this magical thinking, of the role of talismans and magic charms, and of course formal religion as well. But it's been one of the most interesting chapters that people have written to me about in all kinds of capacities. Many people wanting to know if I believe this, if there's a part of it, and what I typically say is I have my own thoughts here, but what I think is important to understand is that many of the soldiers believe this. And I write about the importance of these stories to the soldiers and the way that they tell stories, and how after the war, when there was opportunity to debunk these stories, if they were in fact made up, and soldiers have been known commonly to trick civilians with all kinds of tales, but if these were stories that were fake and were not believed and told for some other purpose, very few soldiers, and none that I have encountered, debunked these stories. And so I think there's something to think about there, and you may want to read the book. Here's a blatant plug, go out and buy it, to explore what I say there, and maybe how your own research and beliefs fit into that. Now, there's other aspects to the book. I have sections on reading and writing home. I do love that cartoon on the left called Diversion. It was in a Canadian publication. You can see that's a hard-bitten NCO, and it's hard to read, but he is furiously reading at this novel called Cupid's Net, if I can read that correctly. It's a love story, right? And we should remember, again, they're not just reading detective novels and horse racing novels, although those are popular, that they would read all kinds of things. Film is important, and I talk about film. I talk about Charlie Chaplin. Charlie, who was loved by almost everyone. And one of the things I find interesting about Chaplin, which I throw out to you as a group, is is how these cultural figures, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the talk, bring together the empire. Charlie Chaplin was popular with Canadians and Americans and the French even, the British, and I assume the Australians and New Zealanders too. So he's an interesting figure. If we think of Harry Lauder as another one, the Scottish singer who was much loved by the Canadians and the British and other forces. We think of Bruce Banesfather. Think about how these cultural figures help to unify the empire's forces. We often talk about the differences between the Australians and the Canadians and the Americans. They're not part of the empire, I know, the British and others, but there's much that unifies as well. And I encourage you to have a think about that. I talk about poetry in the book, but that is a part of this culture that has been explored in tremendous detail, but not the lowbrow poetry. I think that's important. When the soldiers wrote with the grade 6 level of education, they weren't like Sassoon or Owen. They weren't like Canadian John McCrae or Canon Scott. They wrote about the things that mattered to them, ode to a cigarette or a sandbag, or trying to find the words to capture the feeling of having lost a best friend or a chum. And I think that too is a culture that matters. And I think maybe I'll finish up here and then open it up for questions and comments. One of the things when I was writing this book was how to end it. I wasn't sure if I would end this on November 11th, 1918, and I realized that wasn't right. I had to talk about the culture coming back home. And I love this photograph. It's been colorized, but it is of downtown Ottawa. If you know Ottawa, those are the Parliament buildings in the far right. And almost where there's a circle in the ground is where our National Memorial is today. It's a staggering image. This is Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, photographed in Ottawa, I think on the 19th of March, 1919, when they return home. One gets a sense of the scale and the sweep of people. And I find it just so interesting that there's a gap almost exactly where the National Memorial will be built and erected 20 years later, almost to the month. Our National Memorial was unveiled in May of 1939. And so what happened to the culture? Well, you'll have to read the book to get a sense of that, but I argue that this is a culture that was both a shield during the war and that forged a resiliency. It brought Canadians together. It helped as an expression of Canadian identity. It reveals how they coped and endured and aspects of masculinity as well. And much of the culture comes back, as you know. It comes back in the form of a different death culture, but one much more sanctified. It comes back with those memory objects, the souvenirs in the trench art. It comes back in the slang and the language. The swearing the soldiers tried to clean up. There's great letters in 1919 and early 1919, some coming from Sir Arthur Currie, the Canadian Boer Corps commander, who was known as an incredible swearer. He could swear machine gun-like for a minute straight. And all kinds of wonderful vulgarities. But he was writing in early 1919 that the Canadians needed to clean up their language or they would be viewed as barbarians before they returned home to their loved ones. And I talk about the importance of songs, and I talk about the importance of the Legion Halls, the Great War Veterans Association, and then in 1925 coming together to form what will eventually be the Royal Canadian Legion. I talk about the reunions, and together how the culture continues to reverberate through time over the decades. And one of the things I talk about at the end of the book is the strange memory that emerged that some like Gary Sheffield and others have written about, Barry Bond and such people, exploring the very negative view of the war, the disillusionment, that it was fought for no reason, that it was about homicidal generals sending off the young to be butchered in the abattoir. And it's a fine line. I don't want you to think that I'm arguing that the war was good. It wasn't. It was awful, and soldiers suffered in every way. And yet after the war, many of them had strong, positive, nostalgic views of their service. And they could hold those with the idea that the war had been awful and they had lost some of their best friends. There's a contradiction there, but they found ways to make it work. And I would suggest that we who study this generation also need to understand the multifaceted, multiple views of the war. And I would argue to you today that the culture is an important way to understand that comradeship. It's an important way to see and understand how the soldiers dealt with the death and the loss of friends and the dehumanizing experience. This is a culture that brought these men together, even as death stalked them daily. Somehow they found a way to stay in the fight, to believe in the cause. They were aided by their comrades. They followed their leaders. But I would argue as well, the culture plays a key role, and that ultimately they were not, for the most part, passive victims, but active participants in shaping their war experience. Through a study of soldiers' culture, one sees a story of resiliency, not resignation. And this culture returned to Canada with the veterans. It's a culture, a wartime culture, that then became a veterans culture that helped also to sustain them, that bound them together, that allowed them to make sense of their war experience. Thank you very much, everyone.
Tim, thanks ever so much indeed. That was absolutely tremendous. So in the tradition of how we actually end these presentations, everybody who's enjoyed that, if you'd like to raise your hands on the old thing at the bottom as a quasi round of applause. Tim, I can confirm that we've got a full house of people.
I'll raise my hand too. Thank you.
Digitally raising their hands as a round of applause there. So thanks for that, Tim, and thanks for everybody for joining that round of applause. Right, it's Q&A time, and by heck, we've already got some questions in that were coming in pretty thick and fast during that presentation. So I've got my work cut out right now just to deal with this. So here we go. Alan Atkinson, let me just. Hi, Alan. You're now live. Fire away with your question, please, Alan.
Oh, evening, Tim, or good morning to you, or afternoon.
Yeah.
Thanks,
very
Alan.
interesting talk, for which many thanks. In terms of culture, you did mention, you mentioned somewhere in the talk, the French Canadians. To what extent was there any difference culture-wise between Canadians and Newfoundlanders, in the sense that in those days, Newfoundland was still a dominion and not part of Canada?
Yes, great question. Thanks, Alan. And just to remind people that Newfoundland didn't join Canada until 1949, and really viewed Canada always with a very wary eye. There's a famous poem about the Canadian wolf that is coming to stalk them, a bit like the way Canadians have viewed Americans through much of the history of losing our independence. Newfoundland, as you know, had its own independent regiment. The Royal Newfoundland Regiment didn't serve with the Canadians. Their first engagement was at Gallipoli, I think with the 29th Division, and they returned to the Western Front and largely annihilated on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, and rebuilt and then continuing to fight and nearly annihilated again at the Battle of Cambrai in December of 1917. Very proud military service in Newfoundland. I was in Memorial last summer speaking there. Incredible interest in Newfoundland's military history, naval history, forestry contributions, and also very, very wary about being lumped in with the Canadians. And I've written about Newfoundland and the war. Every time a Newfoundlander was considered to be a Canadian by someone, they would argue very strongly that they were a separate colony and very much saw their war effort as being quite separate. So thanks for that. We think that about 4,000 Newfoundlanders served in the Canadian Expeditionary Force, and I think the figure is about 500 in the Royal Canadian Navy, which was quite a small, one might even say pathetic naval contribution, nothing like the Second World War. But thanks, Alan.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks for that.
Thank you.
Right. Paul.
Hi. Yeah, I'm glad I'm not sitting in my pajamas, actually, Tim. Quite a lot of writing on the CEF makes no reference to the First Nations troops. The more recent examples, like Timothy Weingard, clearly has gone into it in some detail. When you're looking at gathering information on the experience of members of the CEF, does the preponderance towards oral history with Indigenous people present you with much of a problem in gathering a good sample, or has it actually been documented in later years?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. There were about 4,000 Indigenous Canadians who served in the CEF. These are largely those Indigenous people who were on reserves, and so we think, in fact, that there may have been others who were not on reserves and who wouldn't have been counted by the Indian agents. And this takes a bit of explanation, but the Indian agents were government agents who really controlled almost all lives of Indigenous people in this time period, and really up until quite recently. For a broader context and understanding, Canada is going through a period, and has been for about at least 10 years, of trying to reconcile treatment of Indigenous people in Canada, which has been widely regarded as being horrible in almost every way. And one of the fascinating aspects of Indigenous people and those trying to reclaim aspects of the history is through military history, where about 4,000 served in the First World War, about 3,600, if I have the figure right, for the Second World War, and many other Indigenous people serving in the Korean War and in peacekeeping operations, and today in the Canadian Forces. So there is an interest, a growing interest. You mentioned Timothy Weingard's book. It's probably the best survey of this for King and Kanata, it's called. And there really is a significant interest here in this. And in my edited book on 1919, there's a chapter in there on Indigenous veterans returning. And the author, Brian McDowell, looked at the Indian agents when veterans came back to the reserve, interviewed them for their war experience, and also as a bit of a facility to deal with pension claims. And so there's interesting sources there. There are not a lot of oral histories that have come to light, and of course all of the Great War veterans are gone now, but you can find traces of it in the records. And I do write about this in my book, and one of the interesting things I write about is how Indigenous veterans came back to Canada, used their service that trumped their race, in effect, to fight for greater rights. And Francis Peg Magabo is just one. He was a 3-time recipient of the Military Medal. He served from August 1914 to the end of the war. He returns to his band and fights for greater rights. Now, he faced tremendous opposition. But these are important stories, and I guess maybe the larger picture there is what happens to veterans when they return. And we have a sense in all of the various combatant nations of how veterans both struggled for what was felt to be owed to them, the debt, be it care and pension or recognition or jobs, and those who succeeded and those who did not. And generally for Canada, Canadian veterans received more money than those from Britain, and certainly more so than defeated countries. And yet there was great struggle, and not a sense that the state should be intervening in the lives of these veterans. And so they were given land grants, but the land was terrible, and almost half of them had gone bankrupt by 1929. And there was a sense of grievance that drove many of the veterans organizations.
Okay, thanks very much.
Great, thanks for that. Thanks for your question there, Paul. Gerald.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tim. You've begun to touch on my question there, but let me ask you again, for Canadians and Newfies, was it easy to be re-assimilated into civil life? They hadn't had such a long time in the army and in the Western Front, perhaps, as the average Brit, for example. But you've talked about the pensions there and so on. Have you, was it generally easier in Canada, do you think, to be
No,
assimilated back?
no, I don't think it was. 1919 was a year of turmoil in Canada. There were strikes across the country, much like we see in Britain. Veterans returned. Of course, the pandemic flu was running its course and would ultimately kill 50,000 Canadians. The state gave basically money to veterans, about on average, about $500 if you served about 2.5 years in the forces, a little more if you served longer on the Western Front. That went pretty quick, and there were not a lot of jobs in Canada. There was a sense of grievance among Canadian veterans, and they banded together in 1921 and 1922, and they petitioned the government for a $2,000 bonus. They thought that every veteran deserved that to help them go forward, and the government denied them that. And so there was quite a lot of a sense that their service had not been worthwhile, that the state had abandoned them. And we see emerging from this period a greater sense of disillusionment. I think it's less about the war, which many soldiers understood to be, in the terms of the time, a war that had to be fought, a war where Canada had to stand shoulder to shoulder with Britain, a war of liberation of the Belgians and the French, a war against German militarism. And yet after the war, the way the veterans were treated, some of the veterans, quite rightly, I think, soured on this. Where there was success was in state medicine. And for those soldiers who were grievously wounded, there was a new medical system created, a federal one. In Canada, the healthcare system is done at the provincial level. So we do see a significant change there. And perhaps the greatest legacy, as I write about in my new book, The Fight for History, was that the veterans of the Second World War benefited far more because their fathers and their uncles and their, I suppose to a lesser extent, maybe their mothers, had served in the Great War and had emerged, and there had been this disillusionment. So Canada did a far better job in 1945 and 1946.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thanks for your question, Gerald. Angela.
Yes, I noticed one of the earlier photographs that got a picture of a guy who looked as though he'd shaved his head down either side and left a strip in the middle, almost as you'd see young people today doing that. And I just wondered if this is a picture of an Indigenous Canadian, or was that a style that was adopted by a lot of Canadian soldiers in those days?
Yeah, you don't see a lot of that. I think today would be called a mohawk. And it does happen. It largely happens to keep hair from collecting lice and the dirt and the deprivation in the trenches. They did keep their hair short in a soldierly way, and they had to do that. And you'll notice there are no beards as well, although mustaches generally allowed and encouraged for officers. It's a really interesting image, and I don't believe he's an Indigenous soldier, but I do think it's terrific. And I don't know if you can still see it here on the screen. I brought it up. Oh, you can. That's good. Yeah. I quite like it, and he's smoking a pipe, I think, there. And another interesting thing, just how these photographs can tell us so much. This is the war where most Canadians went in smoking pipes, but emerged smoking cigarettes. And cigarettes really begin to take over for the next 30, 40, 50 years. So I've always thought that the use of historic photographs and works of art, and especially material culture, can tell us other things in addition to the letters and diaries and written accounts. And the image on the right, I think, is quite a lovely one too. You can see mail being delivered to the soldiers, not in the trenches, but behind the lines. Thanks for the question.
Thanks, Angela. Rick Little.
Hi, Tim. Greatly enjoy your books, by the way.
Thank you.
Question I have is, what was the reaction and effect on the Canadian Corps to the Spanish flu? And can we learn anything from it to help us deal with the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. There's a great book on this by Mark Humphreys, who's looked at the Spanish flu in Canada and the Army. And as I mentioned before, the Spanish flu killed 50,000 Canadians. And I find that astonishing. Canada's death toll in the Great War was 66,000 dead, about 60,000 killed during the war, and about 6,000 in the next 2 years afterwards. And most of them have died from illness or from their wounds. But in those numbers are probably about the 1,200 Canadian soldiers who died from the flu that we think. It's not always easy to determine because many of those who died on their death certificates was listed pneumonia, which of course is a part of COVID, of the Spanish flu at the time, and I think today with COVID. So determining what is actually the death is not always easy, although Humphreys, I think, gives that figure of about 1,200. Two things I guess I find interesting is that there was really, the flu disappeared from social memory in Canada very rapidly, as I think it did around the world, right? And it wasn't until this year with the tragedy we're all living through that we began to, those of us who don't spend our lives reading history and writing about it, remembered that 1918 and 19, the flu was still there, and 1920 if you were in Australia and or New Zealand. So I find it interesting that Canadians, I'll just speak about Canada, I guess, didn't commemorate the Spanish flu dead in the same way as the Great War. We have about 4,000 memorials across the country in every city, every town, every village. There are stained glass windows. There are memorial plaques. There are history books. There is the National Memorial in Ottawa. We have Vimy Ridge overseas and Beaumont Hamel and other markers. And yet there is almost not a single marker for the dead of the pandemic. And that was 50,000 dead in a 6-month period. Why? Well, there's something quite clearly about the man-made disaster of war against, as opposed to a flu that swept through and killed proportionately more, but in a shorter time. And I think there's something about how Canadians of 1918 and 19, they knew death. And I have read letters from soldiers about how they talk about if the flu had come at a different time, we would have been talking about it in much greater detail and probably built memorials to it. And yet it came at the end of this long, terrible, costly, attritional war. And so it was much diminished in that sense. But I can scarcely imagine what it was like to live from 1914 to 1919 to have 66,000 dead soldiers, about 145,000 wounded in battle, about half of them wounded terribly, and then 50,000 dead on top of that. And if there are lessons, Rick, I'm not sure, except, there was the equivalent of social distancing happening in Canada, wearing masks, closing down of schools and theaters. This was followed, and scholars who have looked at this have found in particular cases where these social distancing measures were put into place earlier, the impact of the flu was far less. And I think that's probably a lesson that we who are living through this now have learned as well, perhaps the hard way.
Tim, is there much in the magazines, publications, cartoons, plays that you refer to in your book? Is there anything that mentions the Spanish flu by the
Very
troop?
little, and I'm really surprised.
Yeah.
And very little in the letters as well, and almost nothing in the memoirs. So I have encountered soldiers writing home, hoping that their loved ones are okay. One soldier writing how he thought it was safer to be in Europe and in the army than at home. Others fearful for their loved ones. One soldier, a French-Canadian, Private Lapointe, who returns home to find that his extended family is gutted and dead with half of his brothers and sisters killed, and that must have happened time and time again. And yet what's really interesting is that in the memoirs, typically written 5, 10, 15, 20 years later, very little on the flu. And I think that speaks a little bit to this idea of the forgetting of this traumatic event. But I would encourage some other scholar to investigate that. And there's going to be no shortage of people, I think, trying to look for clues in the past, because I think that there are clues and lessons there to help us in the present. Thanks again.
Question there, Rick. Ragnar Sandberg, beg your pardon if I've mispronounced your name there. Oh crumbs! Right, we're not getting you there, Ragnar. I think you're no. Okay. Ragnar asks this: could you please comment on how Scandinavians were integrated into the?
So Scandinavians, yeah, we had Scandinavians serving in the CEF, and what I find interesting about the CEF, and which I write about in the book, is how it's a great constellation and grouping of Canadians from across the country. It's not just English and French; it is all types. And there was in Manitoba, there were a number of Icelandic communities that enlisted in really high numbers from Gimli, Manitoba, and around that area. There were other Scandinavians. There was a Danish Canadian who received the Victoria Cross, Thomas Dinesen. So again, like other formations, and I have to assume here that, you know, the BEF, well, I know the BEF and the Australians and the New Zealanders consist of all kinds of people who were living there. And it goes the opposite way. A fabulous new book I was just reading on New Zealand, where I believe there's a sense that about 10% of the number of New Zealanders were serving in the BEF or other formations. And in the Canadian Expeditionary Force, talk about 630,000 Canadians who served, but I suspect, and I've done some research here, that at least 50,000 additional Canadians served in the BEF and some in the American forces. So again, sometimes these national designations of the Canadian Corps, or the Canadian Expeditionary Force, are more artificial than was at the time, where they might have been more fluid. And certainly, without a doubt, many Canadians simply saw themselves as part of the British Empire, and that they may have been fighting as part of the Canadian Corps, but really it was for king and empire and country. So multiple identities, and I write about this in my book, about how soldiers could have fluid identities. They could see themselves as from a village or a city. They could see themselves as from a province or a country, and many of them saw themselves as part of the British Empire. So different ways to look at that experience. Thanks very much.
Thanks for that. Thanks for your question there, Ragnar. David Pitcher. David, you're now live. Do you want to?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Lovely. First of all, hello to all the friends over in Ontario there. I've met them a lot in EPA. My question is, one point, you've forgotten, of course, the Japanese, and my interest is 50th Battalion. And there are a lot of Japanese in that one. But my particular question is, my interest is in identifying unknowns. My grandfather's somewhere on Vimy Ridge, which is why I've got this accent. But is the problem with identifying Canadian unknowns with the Commonwealth war graves, or is it at the Canadian end?
So just to mention on Japanese Canadians, and obviously I can't talk about every group that served, but we know that 222 Japanese Canadians served, and if memory serves, 54 were killed, and many received the military medals or the Military Cross. So again, another group, and I write about them in the book, and bringing their own culture into the Canadian Expeditionary Force, and some of that aspect. On the unknown dead and those who died with no known graves, as many of you know, there are 11,285 names on the Vimy Memorial. Those are Canadians who died with no known graves in France. Another 7,000 are on the Menin Gate for those who died with no known graves in Belgium, and others at Tyne Cot and a few other places. So somewhere around 18,000, close to 19,000 there. For those unknown soldiers, we have a figure, it's a little under 7,000. And Canada brought home one of its unknown soldiers in 2000 from Cabaret Rouge Cemetery near Vimy Ridge. And he is now interned at our National Memorial in downtown Ottawa. The challenge of identifying the fallen is, there were many problems. Soldiers who were killed and died on the battlefield and whose bodies were blown apart by shell fire or lost in the mud. I think more often was that often they were buried in cemeteries behind the lines, and that fighting back and forth either tore up their graves, or more likely that their crosses were lost. But to come, I think, to your specific question, how were the dead recorded? They were done at the regimental level or the battalion or the artillery brigade through an adjutant who made note of this. The padres and chaplains played a key role in this. Information was sent back through the various chains of command, so from battalion to brigade to division to corps, ultimately logged, if I'm not incorrect, within the BEF, but also then sent through the overseas ministry, which was a administrative unit in England, and then back to Canada, where the information was gathered at the Department of Militia and Defense and then sent off to all the various communities in Canada, usually by telegram. So it was a complicated process, made more complicated by being several thousand kilometers away. It has always, when I see those telegrams, and we have many at the War Museum, when I see those letters, I am both struck by the language and saddened in trying to imagine those grieving parents who received those letters and the awful agony of that phrase of missing in action. And soldiers wrote about that, of how agonizing it was. They knew for loved ones to not know what had happened to their boys, to their fathers, to their brothers, to their uncles.
Yeah, that's the thing I've got, but my particular question is, there are several groups, Western Front Association for one, who are trying to get the Commonwealth War Graves and the Canadian authorities to recognise people that we think we've identified. And there seems to be a reluctance, shall we say, to accept these identifications. And I was wondering, in the Canadian side, is that at Ottawa or with the Commonwealth War Graves generally?
Can I just pick that up, Tim? I don't mind just picking that up ever so slightly there. I've a slight bit of experience with this myself, in that I do know the Commonwealth War Graves Commission do the initial review of submissions made by from the Coal Project. So the CWGC do the initial review. If they think that there's merit in the submission that's been made, it gets passed to a MOD agency called JCCC. Now, whether or not, I don't actually know the specific answer to your question there, David, but whether or not, if that's clearly a Canadian individual, I don't know if at that stage it goes to an alternative place besides the UK Ministry of Defence, or if it goes over to Canadian side. I'll certainly be interested in finding that.
I'll just add that there is a Canadian branch of the Commonwealth War Graves Association in Ottawa, and they have an office. And so, David, you might want to write to them if you have found a soldier, and I imagine that they will look for particular evidence. It's a separate organization, so not connected to the Canadian War Museum, but I have worked with them in the past in the educational side, and to share stories and to alert Canadians to their important work. So I encourage you to write to them.
Thanks for that. Thanks for your question there, David. Paul Cullum, I don't know if you can start your video there, Paul. I can't hear you. Okay, we haven't got Paul, but Paul's question was as follows. Professor Gary Sheffield spoke a couple of weeks ago about the differences in class between the main officer classes and the average soldier, and now at the start of the war there was a clear dichotomy. Sorry, I can't pronounce. Was this true of the CEF, or was class less important between the ranks? That's Paul's question.
Okay, Paul, thanks. I think it would be fair to say that the Canadians were a more egalitarian force, and certainly the Canadians thought that. Their letters are full of references to British class structure, which they found strange and a little bewildering. But there was a class structure in the Canadian forces as well, without a doubt. We have a pretty good understanding of the Canadian forces. Desmond Morton has written about them, and I have written about them in a real social history way. We know where they come from, and we know their jobs, and it was largely laboring classes, as you would imagine. That's what Canada was, and a good number of farmers, although farmers, for the most part, were encouraged to stay on their farms and to produce the food that was crucial to the war. Officers at the start of the war tended to be almost always better educated, unless they were professional soldiers or had service in the South African War, which was which several thousand Canadians did. But as the war progresses, and the same is true, I think, in the BEF, as officers are killed or wounded, and more men rise from the ranks, especially senior NCOs, and go through officer training, we see a leveling of the class structure. Certainly that is the case with the Canadian Expeditionary Force, and I'm almost certain it's the same with the BEF as well. So class is an important part, and it's part of the Canadian identity as well, that they embraced the notion that that it was a more democratic army when really it was governed by the same discipline and rules and regulations as the BEF as well. So a little bit of that is the question of identity, and I think the concept of carving out a different identity, but some of it is true. There weren't many lords in Canada. There really is not much of an aristocracy in any sense. And it's new money that really distinguishes that group of Canadians. And it didn't come with the same advantages, perhaps, or disadvantages, perhaps, of the class system in Britain.
Thanks for that. Just as an adjunct to that, one of your last sentences there, Tim, was about there's not many lords in Canada. I did actually write a piece about Lord Henry Seymour, who was killed in action as a private in the Royal Canadian Dragoons. He was certainly a member of the British aristocracy, son of the that's an interesting story that Lord Henry Seymour served as a private in one of the Canadian cavalry regiments. So anyway, thanks for your answer there. Chris Weeks. Chris, let me just...
I'm here.
Yep, carry on.
Hi, Tim. Thanks very much. Just to say that, and very briefly, that as you mentioned right at the beginning of your talk, why are people interested in the Great War? Well, I had a great uncle who emigrated to Canada at the age of 14. And I always imagined that perhaps he'd be in the Canadian Army. So I want to compliment your National Archives on the fantastic collection, because I spent a few quid and got 38 pages of stuff about him. Unfortunately, most of those pages were about the medical condition that he had, which prevented him from even leaving Canada, because regrettably he had a sexually transacted disease.
Right.
Anyway, that's a sad tale. However, to my question, as the Canadians couldn't go home on leave, what did they do?
Yeah, well, a lot of them had sex, but they typically had the same leave system as the British soldiers, where officers had leave usually 3 to 4 times a year, usually for 2 weeks, and the privates usually once every 9, 10, 11 months. which was a real source of grievance between the other ranks and the officers. When they did go on leave, they typically had 2 weeks. As I said, they would be paid up front, and they would go typically to Britain, it appears. Some French Canadians chose to go to Paris, which would have been a tremendous cultural coming home for many of them. But most Canadians end up in Britain. They're drawn to the big cities, often where they have family. And if not, almost all of them end up in London. They do all the things that British soldiers did. They drank too much. They ate well. They stayed in hotels they couldn't afford. They met women. The Canadian soldiers had a reputation for high venereal disease rates. About 66,000 cases were recorded from the 450,000, so about 1 in 9, which was higher than almost any other national force that I know of, even the Randy Australians. They were able to see the historic sites, and I'm always amazed at that. I mean, there's a pretty solid scholarship on the soldier as tourist. And at my museum, at the Canadian War Museum, we have all kinds of postcards and maps and discussions of historical architecture. And for the, for soldiers who were educated, who had read about Westminster Abbey, or who had, knew about the palaces, I mean, this is part of the experience. And I think we shouldn't forget that. If you lived in a farm in Saskatchewan, or even you're a factory worker in downtown Montreal, the experience of going overseas and to be in London or Paris, that's astonishing for any person at any time in their history, but especially for these young men. And I think we shouldn't forget that experience. And I write about it in this book, The Secret History, and I've written about it in other books as well.
Thank you.
Super, thanks for your question there. Bill, let me just unmute you there. Okay, we can't hear Bill. Bill's question was the term Canucks for Canadians a Great War invention? And if so, do you know the origins, Tim?
Canucks. Yeah, the Canadians did call themselves Canucks. It's interesting, the phrase, the British Tommy, or the French Poilu, or the Australian Digger, or the New Zealand Kiwi, that, Tommy Canuck was used, but so was the term Canada, as a noun, as an identifier, and like, hello, Canada. So I find that interesting. Canuck, I haven't seen a lot of references. There are a number of songs that use the term Canuck. Johnny Canuck Comes Home was one of the big hits of the war. But I think that the Canadian soldiers were often comfortable using the term Tommy. They just used Canadian Tommy. So I've seen that more often than Canuck, although it's a part of that as well. And so the term Canuck is a pre-war term, and I'm not sure what it is linked to, but it's one that continues to be used to this day.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Last couple of questions, because we're plowing on time-wise. So we'll go with Pat for your question now. Pat, you're live. Do you want to fire away?
Hello, thank you, Tim. Very interesting. How many Canadians that fought, I think you touched on it at the beginning, were first generation? Because I know on our tiny little village war memorial in Somerset, we've got 3. That's right. One in particular, the schoolmaster's son had just gone over there. And did they all go back to Canada, or did some of them stay here?
Yeah, Pat, great question. And we have a pretty good sense of the buildup of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, and about half were British born. But again, we don't know if they arrived in 1912 or 1902 or 1892. So there's a difference there. By the end of the war, it was slightly more Canadians, if one includes the 170,000 Canadians who stayed in Canada. I think the question of the memorial is really interesting as who claims the soldier. And I know of many cases where Canadian soldiers are on British memorials in towns and villages and cities. And I think, in fact, that they're probably on Canadian memorials too. So that's interesting. And there are cases documented in Canada of Canadian soldiers who are on multiple memorials because various towns or cities claim them. Perhaps the place where they were born and where their parents were, perhaps the place where they enlisted from, perhaps the place where their widow or children live. So again, a really interesting notion of perhaps the fluid nature of commemoration as well, and how some of the national boundaries that we think about may be more artificial, and were certainly more artificial at the time. Having said that, there was a pretty stringent desire by the Canadian authorities to make sure that the right Canadians were on Vimy Ridge Memorial and the Menin Gate and by their units. And they went by the units. They went by those records that we were talking about before. And there are errors in those records, and there are misspelled names. And one of the, I think it was David talking about, or Chris talking about, the personnel files, which are all digitized, so you can find them at the Library Archives Canada. That's our National Archives. You look under First World War attestation papers, and most of the 620,000 soldiers have their digitized papers there. So if you're interested in finding someone, that's a great place to go. It contains largely the tombstone data and the medical information, but there is sometimes information on death as well. So I encourage those researching that's a place. So thanks, Pat.
Thanks for that. David Fuller, you're last up. You had an interesting question, so I've saved to a certain extent your interesting question till last. David, fire away.
Oh, thanks. Hi, Tim. Dave Fuller.
Hi, David.
Yeah, I was thinking of Fuzel's book, The Great War of Modern Memory, and talking about the estrangement the soldiers felt. And I just wondered, was that true in Canada when they came home? Did they feel like they were out of touch with the Canadians they were going home to?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's not an uncommon feeling for veterans in the Second World War and the Korean War and Afghanistan veterans, Canada's Afghanistan veterans. It's not easy to talk about war. It's not easy to make meaning out of war. It often takes time. There are physical wounds. There are mental wounds. I think in the 21st century, we have a greater understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I write about this in the book in terms of culture. And then one of the things I argue is that this culture that the soldiers created to help sustain them as a shield, to bind them together, which was not meant to be shared in many cases with civilians. After the war, it's a similar veterans culture, but again, not meant to be shared. And there's all kinds of accounts of the children of veterans, often who served in the Second World War, saying, I wanted to ask my dad about the war, but he never talked about it. Or when he did talk about it, it was at the Legion Hall, and for decades, only veterans were allowed to be there. And so, yes, I think that the silence around war is a topic that many historians and writers are exploring now, and I have done that as well. And I think it's true. I think it is not easy to talk about war, and that contributes sometimes to the strange silences that we have about war and that experience. And with my Second World War books, as I toured the country and talked to Canadians, I often hear from people the most common thing: I wish I was able to ask my dad or my uncle about what they had done. They didn't want to talk about it. I didn't have the words, and they passed away before we could talk. And I think that that's a common thing I've heard. And it's even more so for the Great War. I think there are issues of masculinity here as well. This is not the Oprah Winfrey generation. Get up on a couch and pour your guts out. There was a stoicism to that generation for the most part. And what happened on the Western Front often stayed there, or it was kept and carried by the men who marched forward into their post-war lives.
Right. And David, if I could just add a little comment for that earlier questioner who was wondering about other countries' natives who served. We had a speaker at Central Ontario branch a couple of years back, Cliff Pereira, who did a study of Chinese workers who were actually put on trains in Vancouver, shipped across the country, weren't allowed to leave the train, put on boats in Halifax and sent over to be labor corps and servants and stuff. And he had to go through secondary records because they were all just named Coolie.
Yeah.
Quite a challenge, but he has managed to find some ways of getting at those records. So Cliff's a great source for that kind of thing.
Great piece of work is obviously done there. So thanks for that, David. Thanks, Tim, for your answer there to David's question. Okay, folks, we've overrun. I like not to go too late with these, and we're now at 20 to 10 UK times. So once again, if you'd like to raise your hands as the quasi round of applause for Tim's contribution to the evening, and I can confirm, Tim, that there's digitally a lot of hands going up there as the round of applause. So thanks indeed, Tim, for that. That's been thoroughly enjoyable and very vibrant questions tonight. Well, they're always good, but really apologies to everybody who asked a question. I just simply couldn't get to them, otherwise we'd be here still for another hour or so. So apologies for everybody whose question didn't get asked this time. Just a brief advert. The next two WFA webinars are this coming Saturday morning, when we've got Paul Cobb talking about the great General Monash of the Australian Corps. If anybody's up on Saturday morning, 8:30, please do join us for that. And then next week, 7 days time, talking about poverty and prosthetics. So that will be another splendid evening. So that's the advertising over. Tim, sincere thanks again for that superbly paced presentation. I thought it flowed very well indeed. Thoroughly enjoyed that. And obviously the content as well, not just the pace of it. It was a brilliant exposition. So sincere thanks to Tim for that. I'll wish everybody a good evening, and hope to see everybody for a future one. But finally, Tim, thanks very much. Thank you and good night.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, broke the spell of 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. The officers get